Thank you for joining me in honor of a significant event, not because the event itself was dramatic, because of what it represented, literally the triumph of good over evil. I want to start out by pointing a symbol of that outcome. The flag that you saw raised earlier today over Point Alpha is a special one to me. It was given to me by a soldier in my squadron, one that I did not know by name, but who was proud to serve in the squadron. It had flown over the capital of the United States and had covered his father's casket. Since then, it has accompanied me to Desert Storm and Desert Shield, where it flew in Saudi Arabia, on the antenna of a vehicle as we crossed into Iraq, and later it liberated Kuwait. It flew over the U.S. Embassy in Albania while I was stationed there helping a nation that was valiantly trying to overthrow decades of tyranny and join the free nations of the world. And it flew over Fort Leavenworth on the day that I retired from active duty after 31 years of service. But more important, certainly to me, is the link with today's ceremony. When the Berlin Wall and the border fence between West and East Germany came down, the regiment changed how it patrolled the border, and for a few months we remained committed to the task. And as a result, a single squadron was allocated border duty to free up the other squadrons so as to have more intense training. And as it happened, my squadron, 3rd Squadron, was manning the entire regimental border when the word came down that we would end border duty and cease the decades-long mission of surveillance along the border that divided East and West. Because I have recently been given this flag, I sent it to our northernmost observation post and asked that it be flown on each of the regiment's observation posts and border camps during the last week that we were on the border. So it has been a long journey to come back to the most historic place that it ever flew. I am truly delighted to be here at this historic occasion. This former observation point was truly on the frontiers of freedom, and today we are able to look across and see what was once the Iron Curtain and see freedom as far as you can see and much, much further. And this didn't happen by chance, and it was never a foregone conclusion. I spent over 8 years serving with the Black Horse on this border, spending time in Bad Kissingen, Bad Hersfeld, and Fulda. As a student of history, I hoped that one day the East would be free of Soviet occupation and that Germany would be reunited, but I was not sure it would happen in my lifetime. While serving in Germany, I made 4 visits to the city of Berlin. 3 of them were before the wall came down, and each time I walked down 17 June Street in the west, gazed across the Brandenburg Gate beyond the wall. I then crossed to Checkpoint Charlie in uniform and walked down Unter den Linden, and again was prevented from crossing under the Brandenburg Gate by barriers on the east side. Yet in 1990, only a few short weeks after Germany was reunited, I was able to walk down 17 June Street under the Brandenburg Gate and onto Unter den Linden. That was, to me, probably the proudest I was ever of being a soldier, for having made some small contribution to the events that made that day possible. And a few years later, en route to an assignment in Albania, I had a few days in a rental car and drove to one of our OPs in 3rd Squadron. I climbed up the tower and looked across the free east, and as I did so, a tractor trailer drove in, unloaded a little bulldozer, and began demolishing the buildings that my soldiers had once occupied. I felt a moment of sadness, but then realized the only reason that was happening was because we had won. The West had won the Cold War. I can lay claim to being somewhat of a military historian, having studied modern European history at Stanford with a focus on military history, and then teaching military history at West Point for 3 years. And from my youth, I read and still read extensively on military matters. In addition, I spent over 2 decades immersed in coalition and alliance operations with both NATO and the American, British, Canadian, Australian Armies program, all of which is to say that I consider NATO to be the most successful alliance in history. If you believe, as the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu said, thus those skilled in war subdued the enemy's army without battle, then it truly was the most effective alliance ever. NATO contributed directly to winning freedom for almost all of the Warsaw Pact nations, except Russia, and it did it without firing a single shot. And since that time, I've had a chance to reflect on just why we were successful. A great deal of that success is due to the soldiers of the NATO nations that stood fast in the face of a massive Soviet army. They, the NATO forces, were well-led, well-trained, well-equipped, and had demonstrated over and over again that they were prepared and willing to fight if it came to that. They showed determination. They stayed prepared to fight on a moment's notice with routine readiness tests, major exercises that demonstrated the ability to use their equipment effectively. We all, those of us who served here and those who now enjoy not only their own freedom, but that of our new friends to the West, owe a debt of gratitude to those young men and women and families that served far from their homeland, who endured long separations from their families, and who demonstrated over and over again the professionalism that I know the other side understood. But there is another group that shares just as much of the responsibility for this success, and that is the German people. I can think of no other nation that has voluntarily not only allowed but welcomed a large armed force that roamed their country on numerous large, costly, noisy, and intrusive operations, that often clogged their roads with convoys of fighting vehicles and used their lands for training areas, and then occupied often prime pieces of real estate for decades on end. They showed us friendship and concern. I cannot tell you the number of times I had Germans come up to me and thank me for what we were doing, that went out of their way when we were on exercises to provide a little comfort to our weary troops, from the lady who offered us a place to stay and coffee and sandwiches for our headquarters element during the weekend break between two exercises and refused any money for it. Or the gentleman who, seeing one of our cavalry troops loading their vehicles at the railhead to go home after 2 weeks in the field, asked the first sergeant how many troops were out there on that cold, rainy day, and then brought coffee and pastries for the whole unit. We were not just tolerated, we were welcomed and appreciated, and NATO could not have succeeded without them. So there's two people here today that helped us immeasurably by being the link between the U.S. Army and both the civilian population and our partners in the German Army. While I was the 3rd Squadron Commander, Frau Gabi Hosper was our civil military operations officer. For my 2 years as a regimental operations officer for the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, Michael Trost was our civil military operations officer. So these two were instrumental in helping us secure and maintain good relationships with the surrounding communities, and instrumental in the close and continuous working and social relationships with both the German Army and the Federal Border Police. And without their help, we would not have been successful as we were. The regiment owes them both a debt of gratitude. Gabby and Michael, would you please stand up? And it was those close relationships that is one of the huge differences between our side and the other side. Not long after the building of the Berlin Wall, one of our NATO allies, one of our long-standing friends, decided that they no longer wanted the U.S. and the other NATO, didn't want the U.S. troops in their country. They told us to leave, and we did. Because we and the other NATO forces don't stay where we are not wanted. And compare that to the other side. When the East Germans rose in protest in 1953 against Soviet occupation, when the Hungarians in 1956 wanted the Soviets out, when the Czechs in 1968 wanted the Soviets out, their hopes were crushed by the treads of Soviet tanks. And in the end, the Soviets did leave in large part because they could not sustain themselves among hostile populations, and they knew they could not beat NATO. So today, I want again to say thank you. Thank you to the leadership of the armed forces of NATO that stayed the course, and to the men and women of those forces that sacrificed year after year in a noble cause. Thank you to the German nation for your forbearance, support, and true friendship. that endured for decades and endures today. Without your support and friendship, we would not be here today. And finally, on behalf of the Black Horse Association and all of those who served on this border, I want to thank the Point Alpha Foundation for truly marvelous efforts to retain this small but important piece of history, to remind people that great events, such as the opening of the borders to the east and the granting of freedom to millions of the civilians, did not come easy, but only through the efforts and sacrifices both of the forces involved and the people of Germany who bore the burden with us. So please join me in saluting the wonderful team that has built, cared for, and made this truly magnificent tribute to courage, sacrifice, and steadfast resolve of NATO forces and the German people. And as I call your name, please stand so we can recognize you. Go ahead. Just read what I said down there.
Clint Ancker wünscht sich nun, dass die Damen und Herren im Saal aufstehen, um halt eben auch nochmal diese besondere Leistung der Menschen, die er jetzt gleich nennen wird, noch separat zu ehren.
So, Benedict Stock, the Executive Director of the Point Alpha Foundation, Philip Messler, Director of Studies, Jan Ludwig Antoni, Research Associate, Johannes Schneider, Research Associate, Tim Keller, Research Associate, and Katrin Werth, Assistant for the Director. Thank you so much. Please have a seat. My name is Clint Ancker, and I'm a Black Horse Trooper. It has been an honor to be with you today at this wonderful monument to both freedom and friendship. Thank you for sharing this great moment with me.
Und was mir jetzt noch ganz wichtig ist zum Schluss, ich möchte bitte alle anwesenden Veteranen des Black Horse Regiments darum bitten, zu mir auf die Bühne zu kommen. Wir haben noch eine kleine Überraschung vorbereitet. Dann bitte kommen auch die politischen Vertreter noch zu uns auf die Bühne, dass wir noch ein gemeinsames Gruppenfoto machen können und uns in das Goldene Buch der Point Alpha Stiftung eintragen. I would like to ask all veterans of the Black Horse Regiment to join me on stage for a little surprise. Afterwards, the political representatives and speakers of the day will join us for a group photo. Thank you.
Here we go. Point Alpha, 35th reunion of the Black Horse Last Border Patrol. Great day had by all.
Everybody say hello.